The Phoenix Ascent Podcast, episode The Heavyweight Phoenix, George Foreman's Story. Welcome back to The Phoenix Ascent, the podcast that proves success isn't about luck. I'm your host, and today we're stepping into the ring with one of the most remarkable comeback stories in American history. This is the story of a man who rose from the streets of Houston's most dangerous neighborhood to Olympic glory, then to heavyweight champion of the world. But that's just the beginning, because this champion would lose everything, file for bankruptcy, and then do something that seemed impossible. He'd prove his success wasn't a fluke by building an even greater fortune the second time around. This is the story of George Foreman, and it's a story that will change how you think about failure, faith, and the true meaning of championship. Here is the podcast intro. Success isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time. Welcome to the Phoenix Ascent, the podcast that proves success is never about luck. I'm your host, and this is where we explore the most incredible comeback stories in business history. But these aren't ordinary comebacks. Every entrepreneur we feature has done something extraordinary. They've gone from rags to riches, lost everything, then built it back even bigger to prove their success wasn't a fluke. These are the stories of people who rose from nothing, achieved incredible wealth, watched it all disappear, and then did the impossible. They started over. They rebuilt. They proved that true champions aren't defined by their circumstances, but by their refusal to accept defeat. If you've ever faced failure and wondered if you could come back stronger, if you've ever questioned whether success is about luck or skill, then you're about to discover something powerful. The phoenix doesn't rise in spite of the ashes. It rises because of them. This is the Phoenix Ascent. Let's rise together. Chapter 1, The Streets of the Bloody Fifth. Picture Houston, Texas in the 1950s. While America was experiencing post-war prosperity, there were places that prosperity forgot. One of those places was the Fifth Ward, a neighborhood so violent it earned the nickname the Bloody Fifth. This is where our story begins, on January 10th, 1949. When George Edward Foreman entered a world that seemed designed to destroy him before he could even dream of greatness. The house where George grew up wasn't really a house at all. It was more like a shelter against the storm of poverty that raged through the Fifth Ward. His mother, Nancy Foreman, was a woman of incredible strength who worked as a cook, trying to raise 7 children on wages that barely covered the rent. George's father had abandoned the family when George was young, leaving behind only the echo of broken promises and the weight of responsibility that fell on Nancy's shoulders. But it wasn't just poverty that defined George's childhood. It was the violence that seemed to seep from every street corner, every alley, every broken streetlight in the Fifth Ward. This was a place where children learned to fight before they learned to read, where survival meant being tougher than the next kid, and where dreams were luxuries that most families couldn't afford. George was different from other kids, though not in ways that seemed promising at first. By the time he was a teenager, he stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoe size running neck and neck with his age. He was an imposing figure, but that imposing presence was fueled by anger, desperation, and a growing addiction to alcohol that started when he was just 15 years old. School held no appeal for a young man whose stomach was often empty and whose future seemed predetermined by the zip code he was born into. George dropped out after the 9th grade, joining the 70% of African Americans in Texas who never completed high school. Education seemed irrelevant when you were focused on surviving each day, when you were washing dishes at the same restaurant where your mother cooked, scrubbing plates for pennies while watching the world pass you by. But the real money, George discovered, wasn't in the dish pit. It was on the streets after dark, when he could use his size and growing reputation to take what he needed from people who had more than he did. He became a street fighter, a thief, someone who solved his problems with his fists and took what he wanted when the sun went down. The cycle was vicious and predictable. Steal money to buy cheap liquor, drink to find the courage to steal again, wake up with nothing but regret and the need to start the cycle over. One morning, George woke up in his bed wearing nothing but his underwear, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. Next to him was a pamphlet that someone had left. Perhaps his mother, perhaps a concerned friend, perhaps a stranger who saw a young man destroying himself one bottle at a time. The pamphlet was titled, "I Am an Alcoholic," and as George stared at those words, he realized he was looking at his future, if nothing changed. This was rock bottom for George Foreman, but sometimes rock bottom is exactly where you need to be to start building something real. Because at that exact moment in American history, when a young man from the Fifth Ward was staring at his own destruction, something remarkable was happening in 1968 Washington, D.C. President Lyndon B. Johnson was launching what he called the War on Poverty. And one of the weapons in that war was a program called the Job Corps. The Job Corps was designed to take young people like George, dropouts, street kids, the forgotten and the written off, and give them a second chance. It was a domestic version of JFK's Peace Corps, offering basic education and paid vocational training in camps and centers across the country. For someone like George, who had never been given a real opportunity in his life, it represented something he'd never had before: hope. When George walked into that local employment center, he was told the program was only for adults, but the staff saw something in this towering teenager, something that made them mention another option: the Job Corps program specifically designed for young people. It was a chance to leave Houston, to leave the Fifth Ward, to leave behind everything that had defined his life up to that point. George Foreman was about to discover that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is being forced to start over in a place where nobody knows your name, where your past doesn't define your future, and where the only thing that matters is what you're willing to build with your own two hands. Chapter 2: The Making of a Champion. The Job Corps sent George Foreman first to Grants Pass, Oregon, and then to Pleasanton, California. For a young man who had never been outside of Houston's Fifth Ward, this journey might as well have been a trip to another planet. Everything was different. The air was cleaner, the streets were safer, and for the first time in his life, George was surrounded by people who believed he could become something more than his circumstances. But it was in Pleasanton where George's life would change forever, though he didn't know it at the time. There he met a man named Doc Broadus, a boxing trainer who saw something in this angry, towering teenager that even George couldn't see in himself. Doc Broadus looked at George Foreman and saw raw power, untapped potential, and a young man who needed something to channel all that rage and frustration into something constructive. Boxing wasn't just a sport to Doc Broadus. It was a form of salvation. He had seen too many young men like George, kids who had all the physical tools to succeed, but lacked the discipline and direction to use them. Boxing could teach discipline. Boxing could teach respect. Boxing could teach a young man that real strength wasn't about hurting people weaker than you. It was about pushing yourself beyond what you thought was possible. George's introduction to boxing was unlike anything he had experienced on the streets of Houston. This wasn't about anger or desperation or taking what belonged to someone else. This was about technique, strategy, conditioning, and mental toughness. It was about learning to control not just your opponent, but yourself. For someone who had spent his teenage years feeling completely out of control, this was a revelation. The transformation wasn't immediate. George was raw, undisciplined, and carried all the emotional baggage of his upbringing into the ring with him. But Doc Broadus was patient, and slowly, methodically, he began to shape the street fighter into something resembling a boxer. George learned to throw a proper jab, to move his feet, to think 3 moves ahead instead of just swinging wildly and hoping for the best. What became clear very quickly was that George Foreman possessed something that couldn't be taught: devastating natural power. When he connected with an opponent, the fight was usually over. His left jab, which he would later call the best punch in boxing, was like a piston, snapping out with mechanical precision and bone-crushing force. But it wasn't just the power. It was the way George carried himself in the ring, the intimidating presence that made opponents nervous before the first bell even rang. George fought only 20 times as an amateur, but those 20 fights were enough to catch the attention of the U.S. Olympic boxing team. In 1968, at just 19 years old, this former street thug from Houston's Fifth Ward was selected to represent the United States at the Olympic Games in Mexico City. It was a journey that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier, when George was washing dishes and stealing wallets to survive. The 1968 Olympics were held against the backdrop of tremendous social and political upheaval in America. The civil rights movement was at its peak, the Vietnam War was raging, and young African-American athletes were using their platforms to make powerful statements about racial injustice. It was in this charged atmosphere that George Foreman stepped into the ring to compete for Olympic gold. In 4 Olympic bouts, George went the distance only once. His opponents simply couldn't withstand the power and aggression that he brought to the ring. Fight after fight, George demolished his competition with a combination of raw strength and the technical skills that Doc Broadus had drilled into him. But it was the gold medal bout against Jonas Sepulus of the Soviet Union that would define not just George's Olympic experience, but his entire relationship with his country. The fight against Sepulus was over in the second round. George's power was simply too much for the Soviet boxer to handle, and when the referee stopped the fight, George Foreman was the Olympic heavyweight champion. But what happened next was pure George Foreman. Spontaneous, emotional, and completely authentic. As the crowd erupted in celebration, George began dancing around the ring, and then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He grabbed a small American flag and waved it triumphantly as he continued his victory dance. This wasn't a calculated political statement or a choreographed moment for the cameras. This was a young man from the streets of Houston expressing pure joy and gratitude for a country that had given him a second chance through the Job Corps program. That image, George Foreman dancing with the American flag after winning Olympic gold, became one of the most iconic moments in Olympic history. It was a powerful symbol of redemption, of the American dream realized, of a young man who had risen from the absolute bottom to the very top of his sport. But more than that, it was proof that George Foreman's success wasn't an accident or a stroke of luck. It was the result of hard work, discipline, and an unwavering belief that he could become something greater than his circumstances. When George returned from Mexico City with his gold medal, he was no longer just a former street kid from the Fifth Ward. He was an Olympic champion, a symbol of American excellence, and a young man with unlimited potential. The boxing world was watching, and everyone wanted to know the same thing. What would George Foreman do next? The answer was simple. He was going to turn professional, and he was going to become the heavyweight champion of the world. Because George Foreman had learned something important in those years between the streets of Houston and the Olympic podium in Mexico City, he had learned that when you combine natural talent with relentless work ethic, when you channel anger into discipline, when you refuse to accept that your circumstances define your destiny, there is literally no limit to what you can achieve. The first chapter of George Foreman's rise was complete, but the real story was just beginning. Chapter 3: The Destroyer. When George Foreman turned professional in 1969, the heavyweight division was experiencing one of the most exciting periods in boxing history. Muhammad Ali was the charismatic champion who had captured the world's imagination with his speed, his poetry, and his political activism. Joe Frazier was the relentless pressure fighter from Philadelphia who seemed to get stronger as fights went longer. Ken Norton was the technical boxer who had broken Ali's jaw and proven that the seemingly invincible champion was indeed human. Into this landscape of established stars stepped George Foreman, and from his very first professional fight, it was clear that something different had entered the heavyweight division. This wasn't just another promising young boxer working his way up the rankings. This was a force of nature, a fighter who didn't just beat his opponents, he destroyed them. George's professional record began to read like a medical report. Opponent after opponent was carried out of the ring on a stretcher or helped to their corner by concerned referees. By 1972, George had compiled a perfect record of 37 wins and 0 losses, with 35 of those victories coming by knockout. But it wasn't just the numbers that were impressive. It was the way George was winning these fights. From 1971 through 1974, George Foreman never fought a single bout that lasted longer than 4 rounds without ending in a knockout or a resounding victory. He had become something that the boxing world had rarely seen. A fighter so dominant, so overwhelmingly powerful, that other heavyweights were genuinely afraid to get in the ring with him. Promoters started calling him the Destroyer, and the nickname fit perfectly. George's fighting style was unlike anything the heavyweight division had seen before. While Ali danced and moved, while Frazier bobbed and weaved, George simply stalked forward like an unstoppable machine. His left jab was like a piston, snapping out with mechanical precision and enough force to knock most men unconscious. When he threw his right hand, it was with the intention of ending the fight immediately. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourishes, just pure, devastating efficiency. But George's most terrifying weapon wasn't his punching power, it was his presence. When he entered a ring, the atmosphere changed. Opponents who had been confident and relaxed during their preparation suddenly found themselves dealing with a level of intimidation they had never experienced before. George didn't just beat fighters physically, he broke them mentally before the first punch was thrown. The boxing world took notice, and by 1973, George had earned the right to challenge Joe Frazier for the heavyweight championship of the world. Frazier was the undefeated champion, a man who had never been knocked down in his professional career, a fighter who seemed to get stronger as fights progressed. Most experts expected a long, brutal war between 2 of the most powerful heavyweights in history. What happened instead was one of the most shocking performances in boxing history. George Foreman didn't just beat Joe Frazier, he demolished him. In the first round, George knocked Frazier down not once, not twice, but 3 times. Each knockdown was more devastating than the last, and by the time the referee stopped the fight in the second round, it was clear that a new era in heavyweight boxing had begun. The victory over Frazier wasn't just a changing of the guard, it was a statement that George Foreman was operating on a different level than every other heavyweight in the world. Joe Frazier had been considered virtually indestructible, and George had made him look like an amateur. The boxing world was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. George Foreman might be unbeatable. George's next offense came against Ken Norton, another undefeated heavyweight who had proven his credentials by breaking Muhammad Ali's jaw in their first fight. Norton was a technical boxer, a student of the sweet science who relied on precision and timing rather than raw power. Many experts thought Norton's boxing skills might be enough to solve the George Foreman puzzle. They were wrong. George destroyed Ken Norton even more convincingly than he had destroyed Joe Frazier, knocking him out in the second round with a combination that left Norton unconscious on the canvas. 2 fights, 2 former champions, 2 devastating knockouts. George Foreman wasn't just the heavyweight champion of the world, he was the most feared fighter on the planet. But with great success came great responsibility, and George was beginning to understand that being the heavyweight champion meant more than just winning fights. He was now the face of boxing, a role model for young people, and a symbol of American athletic excellence. The shy, angry kid from Houston's 5th Ward was now one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. The money was incredible, more money than George had ever imagined possible. His purses were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and endorsement deals were starting to pour in. For someone who had grown up washing dishes for pennies, This level of financial success was almost overwhelming. George was living the American dream, proof that in this country, it didn't matter where you came from. What mattered was how hard you were willing to work and how far you were willing to push yourself. But success in boxing is always temporary, and George was about to learn that lesson in the most dramatic way possible. Because waiting for him in Zaire, Africa, was a former champion who was hungry to reclaim his throne, a fighter who had been studying George's style and developing a strategy that just might be crazy enough to work. Muhammad Ali was coming for George Foreman's title, and their fight would become known as the Rumble in the Jungle, and one of the most famous sporting events in history. George entered that fight as the overwhelming favorite, the unbeatable champion who had destroyed every opponent put in front of him. He had no idea that he was about to experience the first real failure of his adult life, and that this failure would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to his greatest triumph. Chapter 4: The Fall. October 30th, 1974. Kinshasa, Zaire. The Rumble in the Jungle. These words still send chills down the spines of boxing fans more than 50 years later, because what happened that night in Africa changed not just the heavyweight division, but the entire trajectory of George Foreman's life. George entered the fight as the overwhelming favorite, and for good reason. He had destroyed Joe Frazier and Ken Norton, two men who had given Muhammad Ali tremendous difficulty. The betting odds heavily favored George, with most experts predicting that his youth, power, and intimidating presence would be too much for the 32-year-old Ali, who many believed was past his prime. But Muhammad Ali had been studying George Foreman for months, watching film, analyzing his style, and developing a strategy that would later be called one of the most brilliant tactical performances in boxing history. Ali knew he couldn't match George's power, and he knew he couldn't intimidate a man who had intimidated everyone else. So he decided to do something completely unexpected. He was going to let George punch himself out. The strategy was called rope-a-dope, and it was as risky as it was brilliant. Ali would lean against the ropes, cover up, and let George throw his devastating punches at his arms, his gloves, and his body. The theory was that George, accustomed to ending fights quickly, would exhaust himself trying to land the knockout blow, and then Ali would take over in the later rounds when George's power had diminished. For 7 rounds, the strategy seemed to be backfiring. George was landing heavy shots, and Ali was taking tremendous punishment. The crowd in Zaire was chanting, "Ali, Bomé! Ali, kill him!" But it looked like George might be the one doing the killing. Round after round, George pounded away at Ali's defense, throwing the kind of punches that had ended so many other fights. But something strange was happening. As the fight progressed, George's punches were losing their snap. His legs were getting heavy. His breathing was becoming labored. For the first time in his professional career, George Foreman was experiencing what it felt like to be tired in a boxing ring. He had never needed to pace himself before, had never needed to think about conserving energy, because his fights had always ended so quickly. In the 8th round, everything changed. Ali came off the ropes and began to fight back with a combination of speed and precision that caught George completely off guard. The man who had seemed beaten and battered just moments before was now moving like the Ali of old, throwing combinations that found their mark with surgical precision. And then it happened. A perfectly timed right hand from Ali caught George flush on the chin, and for the first time in his professional career, George Foreman hit the canvas. The most feared heavyweight in the world was lying on his back in a boxing ring in Africa, staring up at the lights while the referee counted him out. The shock was immediate and overwhelming. George Foreman, the unbeatable destroyer, the man who had never even been hurt in a professional fight, had been knocked out by a fighter that many people thought was finished. The crowd erupted in celebration, but George could barely hear them. He was experiencing something he had never felt before, the crushing weight of failure. The loss to Ali was more than just a defeat. It was a complete destruction of George's identity. He had built his entire sense of self around being the most feared man in boxing, around being unbeatable, around being the destroyer who ended fights with a single punch. Now, suddenly, he was just another former champion, another fighter who had been exposed and defeated. The boxing world's reaction was swift and brutal. The same media that had built George up as an unstoppable force now questioned whether he had ever been as good as his record suggested. Critics pointed out that he had never faced adversity before, had never been tested in the later rounds of a fight, had never shown the heart and determination that true champions possess. George continued to fight after the loss to Ali, but something fundamental had changed. The aura of invincibility was gone, and with it went much of what had made George Foreman special. He won some fights and lost others, but he was no longer the dominant force that had terrorized the heavyweight division. The fire that had burned so brightly seemed to be dimming with each passing month. In 1977, after a particularly difficult fight against Jimmy Young, George experienced what he would later describe as a religious awakening. Exhausted, dehydrated, and questioning everything about his life and career, George felt what he believed was a divine calling to leave boxing and dedicate his life to serving God and his community. The decision shocked the boxing world. George Foreman, at just 28 years old and still in his physical prime, was walking away from boxing to become a preacher. He hung up his gloves, left the sport that had made him famous and wealthy, and returned to Houston to begin a new chapter of his life as an ordained minister. George founded the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ in Houston and threw himself into his ministry with the same intensity he had once brought to boxing. He opened the George Foreman Youth Center, a facility designed to keep kids in his old neighborhood away from the drugs, gangs, and violence that had nearly destroyed his own life. He was determined to give back to the community that had shaped him, to be the positive role model that he had never had as a young man. But there was a problem with George's new life as a minister and community leader. It was expensive. Running a church and a youth center required significant financial resources, and George was pouring his boxing earnings into these projects at an unsustainable rate. The money that had seemed unlimited during his championship years was disappearing faster than he had ever imagined possible. By 1983, the unthinkable had happened. George Foreman, the former heavyweight champion of the world, the man who had earned millions of dollars in the ring, was facing bankruptcy. The youth center was struggling financially, the church needed constant funding, and George's investments had not performed as well as he had hoped. The man who had once been one of the most feared fighters in the world was now struggling to pay his bills. The bankruptcy filing was a humbling experience that forced George to confront some uncomfortable truths about his life and his choices. He had walked away from boxing at the height of his earning potential to pursue a calling that, while spiritually fulfilling, was financially devastating. He had sacrificed his own financial security to help others, and now he was paying the price for that generosity. But George Foreman was about to learn something important about himself, something that would set the stage for one of the most remarkable comebacks in sports history. He was about to discover that the same determination and work ethic that had made him a champion in the ring could be applied to any challenge he faced, whether it was in boxing, in business, or in life. The fall was complete, but the phoenix was about to rise from the ashes. Chapter 5: The Impossible Return. George Foreman was 38 years old, had been retired from boxing for 10 years, and was facing financial ruin. The youth center that had become his passion project was struggling to stay open, and the bills were mounting faster than his dwindling savings could cover them. For most people, this would have been the end of the story, a cautionary tale about a former champion who walked away from his earning potential too early and paid the price for his idealism. But George Foreman was not most people. As he sat in his office at the youth center, looking at the stack of unpaid bills and the faces of the young people who depended on the programs he had created, George made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He was going back to boxing. The announcement was met with everything from disbelief to outright ridicule. George Foreman, at 38 years old, after 10 years away from the sport, wanted to return to the heavyweight division and eventually challenge for the world title. Boxing experts called it delusional. Sports commentators called it dangerous. His own family called it crazy. But George had done the math, and the math was simple. He needed money to keep the youth center open, and boxing was the only way he knew to make the kind of money he needed quickly. More than that, George believed he still had something left in the tank, something that 10 years of preaching in community work hadn't diminished. He believed he could still fight, and more importantly, he believed he could still win. The early fights of George's comeback were painful to watch. He was slow, out of shape, and clearly rusty from his long layoff. Opponents who wouldn't have lasted around with the George Foreman of the 1970s were now giving him competitive fights. The media coverage was largely negative, with most writers treating his comeback as a sideshow rather than a serious athletic endeavor. But something interesting was happening as George continued to fight. He was getting better. The reflexes were coming back, the timing was improving, and most importantly, the power was still there. George's punches still carried the kind of force that could end a fight instantly. And as he worked his way back into fighting shape, it became clear that this wasn't just a publicity stunt or a desperate grab for money. George was also discovering something about himself that he hadn't known during his first career. He was actually enjoying boxing in a way he never had before. During his championship years, boxing had been about anger, intimidation, and proving his dominance over other men. Now, boxing was about something different. It was about proving to himself that he could overcome any obstacle, that age and time and circumstances couldn't define what he was capable of achieving. The boxing world began to take notice as George's comeback gained momentum. He was winning fights, looking more like his old self with each performance, and most surprisingly, he was becoming a fan favorite in a way he had never been during his first career. The angry, intimidating champion of the 1970s had been replaced by a smiling, grandfatherly figure who seemed to be having the time of his life in the ring. By the early 1990s, George had worked his way back into contention for the heavyweight title. The division had changed dramatically during his absence. New champions had emerged, new styles had evolved, and the heavyweight landscape looked nothing like it had when George had walked away. But George adapted, adjusted his style to account for his age and changed circumstances, and continued to win fights against increasingly credible opposition. The culmination of George's comeback came on November 5, 1994 in Las Vegas, when he faced Michael Moorer for the WBA and IBF heavyweight titles. George was 45 years old, making him by far the oldest man ever to challenge for the heavyweight championship. Moorer was 26, in his prime, and heavily favored to defeat the aging former champion. For 9 rounds, it looked like the experts were right. Moorer was outboxing George, moving well, landing clean shots, and building a commanding lead on the scorecards. George looked every bit his 45 years, slow and ponderous, seemingly unable to catch up with his younger, faster opponent. The crowd was restless. The commentators were already writing George's boxing obituary, and it seemed like the comeback story was about to end in disappointment. But in the 10th round, something magical happened. George landed a short right hand that caught Moorer flush on the chin, and suddenly the 26-year-old champion was lying unconscious on the canvas. The crowd erupted in disbelief as the referee counted Moorer out, and George Foreman, at 45 years old, had become the oldest heavyweight champion in boxing history. The victory was more than just a boxing triumph. It was a vindication of everything George had believed about himself, about the power of determination, and about the possibility of second chances. He had proven that his original success hadn't been a fluke, that his championship credentials were real, and that with enough heart and determination, it was possible to overcome any obstacle. But the real triumph wasn't the heavyweight title, it was what George had accomplished along the way. The comeback had generated enough money to not only save the youth center, but to expand its programs and reach even more young people in need. George had proven that it was possible to pursue your passion, serve your community, and still achieve financial success, even if it meant taking a path that others considered impossible. The boxing comeback was remarkable, but it was just the beginning of George Foreman's second act. Because while he was proving that age was just a number in the boxing ring, he was also about to discover that his greatest success wouldn't come from his fists. It would come from a simple kitchen appliance that would make him more money than he had ever earned as a boxer. The phoenix had risen from the ashes, but it was about to soar to heights that no one, including George himself, had ever imagined possible. Chapter 6: The Grill That Changed Everything. The year was 1994, and George Foreman had just accomplished the impossible by becoming the oldest heavyweight champion in boxing history. He was back on top of the boxing world, earning significant purses, and had successfully funded his youth center through his remarkable comeback. By any measure, this should have been the end of a perfect redemption story. But fate had other plans for George Foreman, and those plans involved a phone call that would change not just his life, but the lives of millions of families around the world. The call came from a company called Sultan Inc., later known as Russell Hobbs. They had developed a new kind of indoor grill, a compact, electric appliance that could cook meat quickly while draining away the fat. It was a simple concept, but they needed someone to endorse it, someone whose name would give the product credibility and help it stand out in a crowded marketplace of kitchen gadgets. George Foreman was not their first choice. The company had initially approached other celebrities, other athletes, other personalities who might be willing to lend their name to a kitchen appliance. But something about George's story, his comeback, his transformation from angry young fighter to beloved grandfather figure, made him the perfect spokesperson for a product that promised to make cooking healthier and easier. When George first heard about the opportunity, he was skeptical. He was a boxer, not a chef. He was known for his devastating punches, not his culinary skills. What did he know about grills or cooking or kitchen appliances? But as he learned more about the product and the company behind it, George began to see the potential. The grill wasn't just about cooking, it was about health, about making it easier for families to prepare nutritious meals, about taking the fat and grease out of foods that people loved. For someone who had spent years working with young people in his community, someone who understood the importance of good nutrition and healthy lifestyle choices, this was more than just an endorsement deal. This was an opportunity to make a positive impact on people's lives. George agreed to become the spokesperson for what would become known as the George Foreman Grill. But the deal he negotiated was unlike anything the endorsement world had ever seen. Instead of taking a flat fee for his endorsement, George negotiated a deal that would give him a percentage of the profits from every grill sold. It was a risky move. If the product failed, George would make very little money. But if it succeeded, the potential upside was enormous. The George Foreman Grill launched in 1994, and the initial response was modest. It was just another kitchen gadget in a market full of kitchen gadgets, competing for shelf space and consumer attention, with dozens of other products that promised to make cooking easier and healthier. But something about George's endorsement, his genuine enthusiasm for the product, and his credibility as someone who understood the importance of health and fitness, began to resonate with consumers. The commercials featuring George were unlike anything people had seen before. Here was this legendary boxer, this intimidating figure from the world of professional sports, talking enthusiastically about cooking and family meals and the importance of eating healthy. The contrast was striking and memorable, and it helped the George Foreman Grill stand out in ways that traditional advertising never could have achieved. But what really made the difference was that George genuinely believed in the product. This wasn't just a celebrity going through the motions for a paycheck. This was someone who actually used the grill, who understood its benefits, and who could speak authentically about how it could improve people's lives. When George talked about the grill, people believed him because his enthusiasm was real and his credibility was unquestioned. The sales numbers began to climb steadily, and as they did, George's monthly royalty checks grew larger and larger. What had started as a modest endorsement deal was becoming something much more significant. By the late 1990s, George was earning millions of dollars per year from the grill, and the product was becoming a cultural phenomenon. The George Foreman Grill wasn't just successful, it was revolutionary. It changed the way people thought about indoor cooking, made healthy meal preparation accessible to busy families, and became one of the best-selling kitchen appliances in history. More than 100 million units would eventually be sold worldwide, making it one of the most successful product launches in consumer history. But the real breakthrough came in 1999, when Sultan made George an offer that would secure his financial future forever. They wanted to buy the rights to his name and image for the grill business, and they were willing to pay $137.5 million for those rights. It was an astronomical sum, more money than George had ever imagined possible, and it represented the ultimate validation of his decision to bet on himself and the product he believed in. George accepted the offer, and with that single transaction, he became wealthier than he had ever been during his boxing career. The man who had filed for bankruptcy just over a decade earlier was now worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and it had all come from a simple kitchen appliance that helped people cook healthier meals. The irony was not lost on George. He had spent his entire first career trying to hurt people, using his fists to inflict damage and pain on his opponents. Now in his second career, he was helping people live healthier lives, making it easier for families to prepare nutritious meals, and spreading joy and wellness instead of fear and intimidation. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about George's success with the grill was what it proved about his original boxing achievements. Critics had always wondered whether George's early success had been a fluke, whether he had simply been in the right place at the right time, whether his championship reign had been more about luck than skill. The grill's success answered those questions definitively. George Foreman's ability to succeed wasn't limited to boxing. It was a fundamental part of who he was as a person. His work ethic, his determination, his ability to connect with people, his willingness to take risks and bet on himself. These weren't boxing skills, they were life skills. And they had made him successful not once, but twice in completely different fields. George Foreman had proven that true champions aren't defined by their sport or their circumstances. They're defined by their character, their resilience, and their refusal to accept limitations. He had shown that it was possible to reinvent yourself, to find success in unexpected places, and to build something even greater the second time around. The phoenix had not just risen from the ashes, it had soared to heights that no one had ever imagined possible. Chapter 7, The Phoenix Ascent, a legacy that lives on. George Foreman's story is the ultimate proof that success isn't about luck. It's about resilience. It's about the courage to dream big, the wisdom to learn from failure, and the determination to never give up, no matter how many times you're knocked down. Think about the mathematics of George's journey. If he hadn't lost to Ali and Zaire, he might never have found his faith. If he hadn't gone bankrupt in the early 80s, he might never have attempted his impossible comeback. If he hadn't been willing to risk everything at age 38, he never would have become the oldest heavyweight champion in history. George understood something that separates true champions from mere winners. Failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the foundation of success. Every setback taught him something essential. Every loss made him stronger. Every time he was forced to start over, he started better. The defeat in Zaire taught him humility and led him to faith. The bankruptcy taught him the value of every dollar and every opportunity. The years of rejection taught him that other people's opinions don't define your possibilities. But perhaps the most important lesson from George Foreman's Phoenix Ascent is this: your greatest failure often comes right before your greatest success. George's darkest moment, losing everything and facing bankruptcy, led directly to his greatest triumph, becoming champion again at 45 and building a business empire worth hundreds of millions. This pattern repeats throughout the lives of every true Phoenix entrepreneur. The moment when everything seems lost is often the moment when everything begins. The key is having the courage to keep going when giving up would be easier. George Foreman passed away in March 2025, but his legacy lives on in every entrepreneur who refuses to accept that their best days are behind them. In every person who believes that failure is just a detour on the road to success. In every dreamer who understands that age is just a number when you have the heart of a champion. But more than that, George's story lives on as proof that the American dream isn't about being born lucky. It's about being willing to fail, learn, and try again. It's about understanding that every ending is also a beginning. Every failure is also an opportunity. Every Phoenix moment is also a chance to soar higher than you ever imagined. George Foreman Grill, remember that you're looking at more than a kitchen appliance. You're looking at the symbol of what's possible when you refuse to give up. You're seeing the proof that dreams really can come true, not because of luck, but because of the courage to pursue them no matter how many times you fail. George Foreman's Phoenix Ascent reminds us that we all have the power to write our own comeback story. We all have the ability to turn our failures into foundations, our setbacks into setups, our endings into beginnings. The only question is, when life knocks you down, will you stay down or will you rise like a phoenix and show the world what you're really made of? George Foreman proved that champions aren't made by avoiding defeat. They're made by getting back up every time they're knocked down. His legacy will forever remind us that it's never too late to fight for your dreams. It's never too late to start over. And it's never too late to prove that success isn't about luck. It's about the size of your heart and the strength of your spirit. Rest in peace, Big George. Your Phoenix Ascent will inspire generations to come. Closing. George Foreman once said, "The question isn't at what age I want to retire, it's at what income." But what he really taught us was that retirement from dreaming should never be an option, no matter what age you are or how many times you've been knocked down. That's the power of the Phoenix Ascent. It's not about avoiding failure, it's about transforming failure into fuel for something greater. George didn't succeed despite his defeats and setbacks. He succeeded because of them. Though we lost Big George in March 2025, his story continues to prove that it's never too late to rise again, no matter how far you've fallen. His legacy reminds us that true champions are measured not by how many times they win, but by how many times they get back up. Next time on the Phoenix Ascent, we'll explore another incredible comeback story, someone who proved that even when the world counts you out, you can still count yourself back in. If George Foreman's story inspired you, I'd love to hear about it. Visit us at thephoenixascent.com, where you can read more incredible comeback stories and join our community of Phoenix entrepreneurs. And if you know someone who needs to hear that failure isn't final, share this episode with them. Remember, success isn't about luck. It's about the courage to rise again. Until next time, keep ascending. You've just heard another story of failure, grit, and the rise that followed. Because here at the Phoenix Ascent, we don't just admire success, we dissect the fall that made it possible. Remember, every setback is a setup, every loss a lesson, and every flameout a chance to rise again. So if you're facing your own ashes, remember, you're not alone. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. While you are at it, if you like the show, leave us a 5-star review. That really helps spread the word. Join our mailing list if you want to be notified when the next story is ready for you. This has been the Phoenix Ascent. Until next time, keep rising.